There's a moment in Season 2 that changed everything. Rick stands in an open field on Herschel's farm, knife in hand, facing his best friend. Shane is already dying. Rick's blade saw to that, but the real death comes when Carl, just a boy, raises his gun and fires. One shot. Shane doesn't come back. In that field, under Georgia's indifferent sky, we learned something crucial about this world. Some deaths feel like endings, and some feel like justice. Not all character exits are equal. Some leave us hollow. Others leave us strangely satisfied, even when we know we shouldn't be. So what makes a death in the apocalypse feel earned? Is it the violence, the timing, or something deeper? A sense that the story demanded it, that the character's arc found its natural close. Tonight, let's trace that thread together, from Shane's field to the Commonwealth's gallows, and see what patterns emerge. When we talk about satisfying deaths in The Walking Dead, we're not celebrating violence. We're recognizing something more complicated, the difference between a death that shocks and a death that completes. Glenn's death under Negan's bat in the Season 7 premiere was brutal, unforgettable, devastating. But was it satisfying? I don't think so. It was trauma for trauma's sake, a rating spectacle that broke something in the audience and never quite repaired it. Compare that to what happened to the governor back in Season 4, in the mid-season finale, Too Far Gone. His death wasn't just violent, it was inevitable. Michonne's sword through his chest, then Lily's bullet to his head, felt like the story closing a book it had been writing for 2 full seasons. Here's what I mean by satisfaction in this context. Narrative justice. Not revenge, exactly, but a sense that the character's arc reached a conclusion that honored everything that came before. The governor wasn't just a villain. He was a mirror held up to Rick, showing what leadership could become when you lose your humanity in the name of protecting your people. He tortured Glenn and Maggie, kept heads in aquariums, murdered his own followers, and ultimately decapitated Herschel in front of everyone, an act so unforgivable that his death became not just acceptable, but necessary for the story to move forward. When Michonne ran him through, it wasn't just a fight scene. It was a resolution of her personal arc of revenge, the honoring of Herschel's sacrifice, and the symbolic defeat of the tyrant Rick could have become. Then there's a death, like Lizzie's in Season 4's The Grove. Carol takes a little girl who murdered her own sister out to look at the flowers and shoots her in the back of the head. That episode still haunts fans years later, and for good reason. It's one of the most morally complex moments the show ever produced. But here's the thing. It's also oddly satisfying. In the same way a mercy killing can feel like the only compassionate choice in an impossible situation. Lizzie was dangerous. She couldn't distinguish between the living and the dead. She would have killed Judith next. Carol's choice to end her life wasn't revenge or justice. It was prevention, protection, the terrible math of survival. And because the show let us see Carol's hands shake, because it let us hear the pain in her voice, because it never pretended this was easy or right, the death felt earned. So when I say satisfying, I'm talking about deaths where the emotional stakes, the character arcs, and the thematic weight all align. The show sets up a question. What happens to people who can't adapt, who threaten the group, who embody cruelty or chaos? And then it answers that question in a way that feels true to the world it's built. Not every villain needs to die, and not every death needs to feel good. But the ones that do, they tend to follow a pattern, and that's what we're here to explore. Let's start with the villain who set the template, the governor. When we first meet him in Season 3, he seems almost too good to be true, a charismatic leader who's built a functioning town called Woodbury in the middle of the apocalypse. There's electricity, there's food, there's even a strange semblance of normalcy. But then, we see the aquarium tanks full of walker heads in his private room. We see what he does to Glenn and Maggie in the interrogation rooms. We watch him murder his own people when they try to flee. And slowly, over the course of 2 seasons, the show peels back the layers of his civility to reveal something rotten underneath. What makes the governor's arc work, and what makes his eventual death so satisfying, is that the show gives him time. He's not a one-episode villain who shows up, does something evil, and gets killed in the same hour. He's a season-long mirror to Rick, a leader who also lost everything and chose a different path. Both men are trying to protect their people. Both men are willing to make hard calls. But where Rick still clings to some version of his moral code, the governor abandoned his the moment he lost his daughter. That eye patch he wears? It's not just an injury, it's a symbol of his refusal to see the truth, his willingness to hide from what he's become. The tank assault on the prison in Too Far Gone is the culmination of everything we've been watching. The governor shows up with overwhelming force, takes Herschel and Michonne hostage, and demands that Rick's group abandon their home. Rick tries to negotiate. He offers to share the prison. He appeals to the governor's humanity, saying they can all live together, that they don't have to destroy each other. And for a moment, just a moment, it seems like maybe the governor is listening. But then he raises Michonne's katana and decapitates Herschel right there in front of everyone, and the war is on. That's the moment the governor's death becomes not just acceptable, but necessary. He's crossed a line the show can't walk back from. Herschel was the moral center of Rick's group, the voice of compassion and wisdom, and killing him was an unforgivable act. When Michonne finally gets her chance, when she drives her sword through the governor's chest while he's strangling Rick, it's not just revenge. It's justice, earned over 2 seasons of build-up. And then, Lily, the woman whose daughter the governor used and whose trust he betrayed, delivers the final shot. 2 people whose lives he destroyed end him together. That's the pattern we'll see again and again. Satisfying deaths come from arcs that are given time to breathe, from villains whose actions create real stakes, and from resolutions that let the protagonists reclaim their agency. The governor's death honored Michonne's need for vengeance and Herschel's sacrifice. It wasn't clean, it wasn't simple, and it didn't fix everything, but it felt earned. And in a show where death is constant and often meaningless, earned matters more than we might think. Now let's talk about a death that wasn't about vengeance at all. One that was pure, terrible mercy. Back in Season 4, after the prison falls and the group scatters, Carol finds herself traveling with Tyrese and 2 young girls, Lizzie and Mika. They take shelter in a house surrounded by a pecan grove, a place that seems almost untouched by the apocalypse. For a few brief days, it feels like maybe they could stay there, could build something small and safe. And then, Lizzie kills her sister. The Grove is one of those episodes that divides people. Some viewers found it too dark, too cruel, especially given that Lizzie was a child. But here's what makes it work as storytelling, and what makes Carol's choice to execute Lizzie feel, if not right, then at least necessary. The show had been seeding Lizzie's instability for episodes. She named walkers. She fed them like pets. She told her sister that walkers were just different, not dangerous. She nearly smothered Judith to prove walkers and humans were the same. The signs were there, clear and escalating, and the group had been too distracted by other threats to fully process what it meant. When Carol and Tyrese return to the house and find Mika dead, stabbed by her own sister, with Lizzie standing over the body saying, "Don't worry. She'll come back and you'll see." That's the moment the math becomes simple. Lizzie was planning to kill Judith next. She couldn't be allowed near other children. She couldn't be taught, couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be fixed. In a world with functioning mental health care, maybe she could have been helped. But this world doesn't have that. This world only has Carol, who's already lost one daughter and now has to kill another child to save the baby she's protecting. The scene where Carol takes Lizzie out to look at the flowers, borrowing a phrase from the only happy memory Lizzie has left, is as close to a mercy killing as this show has ever depicted. Carol's hands are shaking. Her voice breaks. She doesn't want to do this. But she does it anyway, because in her mind, letting Lizzie live means risking Judith's life, and that's a trade she can't make. The show doesn't glorify the choice. It doesn't frame Carol as heroic. It just shows her doing the impossible math of survival and coming up with an answer that will haunt her for the rest of her life. So why does this death feel satisfying when it's so deeply uncomfortable? I think it's because the show earned it. It set up the problem a child who can't survive in this world, who actively endangers others, and then it forced a character we care about to solve that problem in the only way available. Carol's arc has always been about protection, about becoming the person who does what needs to be done so others don't have to. Killing Lizzie completes that arc in the most painful way imaginable. It's not a victory. It's not even justice. It's just the cost of survival, rendered in the starkest possible terms. And sometimes, the most satisfying deaths are the ones that hurt the most, because they force us to confront what survival actually requires. Let's shift now to a different kind of satisfaction, the kind that comes from watching someone who threatened everything you love get what they deserve. Near the end of Season 4, Rick and his group are on the road to Terminus when they run into a gang called the Claimers, led by a man named Joe. These aren't your typical apocalypse survivors. They're opportunists, brutal and sadistic, following a twisted code of claimed, possessions, and frontier justice. Daryl briefly travels with them before he realizes what they really are. And in the season finale, they catch up with Rick, Carl, and Michonne on a dark road at night. What happens next is one of the most visceral, primal scenes the show has ever produced. The Claimers have them surrounded. One of them, a man named Dan, starts dragging Carl away with clear intent to assault him. Joe holds a gun to Rick's head, taunting him, explaining how they're going to rape Carl and Michonne and make Rick watch before they kill him. And Rick, calm, deliberate Rick, the man who's been trying so hard to hold on to his humanity, snaps. He throws his head back and bites into Joe's jugular, tearing out his throat with his teeth. It's a moment of pure animal violence. Rick doesn't use a weapon. He doesn't make a speech. He just becomes something primal and terrifying, a father protecting his son in the most visceral way imaginable. Then he walks over to Dan, the man who was about to hurt Carl, and stabs him over and over and over until there's nothing left to stab. Daryl and Michonne take care of the other Claimers. And when it's over, Rick is covered in blood, shaking, and Carl is looking at him with something that might be fear or might be understanding. Here's why this death, Joe's death specifically, but really the death of all the Claimers, feels so satisfying. It's the moment we realize Rick will do anything to protect his son. Not just kill, but become something monstrous if that's what survival requires. The Claimers threatened Carl directly, in the most heinous way possible, and the show has a clear pattern. Villains who threaten children don't survive. they can't. The found family bonds that hold the group together are built on the protection of the vulnerable, especially the kids. Anyone who violates that sacred boundary is signing their own death warrant. But what makes this particularly effective is that it's not just about justice, it's about Daryl too. Daryl was traveling with these men. He vouched for Rick, tried to plead for their lives, and offered himself in exchange. And when the violence breaks out, Daryl jumps in without hesitation, fighting beside Rick, even though it means killing men he just spent days with. That's found family in action. That's the bond that supersedes everything else. The claimers' deaths are satisfying not just because they were evil, but because stopping them required Rick and Daryl to fully commit to each other, to the group, to the idea that some threats are so immediate and so unforgivable that there's no room for hesitation. That throat bite? It's still one of the most talked about moments in the entire series. And it works because the show earned. It built the tension, established the threat, and then let Rick cross a line he can never uncross. Sometimes satisfaction comes from watching a protector become a monster, just for a moment, just long enough to keep his family safe. If the claimers' deaths were immediate and visceral, Alpha's death was the opposite, a slow burn payoff that took multiple seasons to arrive. Alpha, the leader of the Whisperers, was introduced in Season 9 and quickly became one of the show's most terrifying villains. Not because she was flashy or loud, but because she was cold, calculating, and utterly convinced of her own philosophy. She wore the skin of the dead. She led a group that lived among walkers. And she believed that human connection, love, family, attachment, was weakness that would get you killed. Her death comes in Season 10's Walk With Us, and the person who kills her is the last one most of us expected, Negan. That's right, the man who bashed in Glenn's and Abraham's skulls, who terrorized our group for 2 full seasons, is the one who slits Alpha's throat and brings her severed, reanimated head to Carol. And somehow, against all odds, it feels right. Here's the setup. Carol has been spiraling since Alpha killed her adopted son Henry. She's obsessed with revenge, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to get it. Earlier in the season, she released Negan from his cell in Alexandria, gambling that his hatred of Alpha's power and maybe his need to prove his redemption is real would drive him to infiltrate the Whisperers and take her out from the inside. It's a manipulative, dangerous plan, and it works. Negan gains Alpha's trust, even seems to form a strange connection with her. And then, when she's at her most vulnerable, when she's shown him where she really feels safe, he kills her. What makes Alpha's death satisfying is layered. First, there's the sheer narrative patience. The Whisperers were a threat for a season and a half. Alpha personally killed major characters we cared about, Henry, Tara, Enid, and put their heads on pikes as a border warning. She terrorized Lydia, her own daughter, to the point where Lydia chose the group over her own mother. The show gave us plenty of reasons to want her gone, but it didn't rush. It let the threat build, let the tension simmer, until her death felt like the only possible resolution. Second, there's the irony of having Negan be the executioner. Negan, who the audience still has complicated feelings about, who we're not sure we can ever forgive, becomes the instrument of justice for one of the show's most purely evil characters. It's villain killing villain, but it's also a step in Negan's redemption arc, proving he can be trusted, that he's willing to do the hard thing even when it costs him. Alpha thought she understood him. She thought they were alike, and he used that assumption to get close enough to end her. Third, and maybe most importantly, there's what her death represents thematically. Alpha believed attachment was weakness. She abandoned her daughter, rejected love, built a philosophy around becoming more animal than human. And she dies because of attachment. Negan's attachment to the people of Alexandria, Carol's attachment to Henry's memory, Lydia's attachment to the found family that took her in. Her death is a rejection of her entire worldview. It says that the thing she saw as weakness, connection, loyalty, caring enough to risk everything is actually what makes people strong enough to survive. Carol gets her revenge, but it's bittersweet. Henry is still dead. The trauma is still there, but the threat is over. The whispers fall apart without her. And for the first time in seasons, it feels like maybe the group can breathe again. That's the power of a well-executed villain death. It doesn't just end a threat. It releases tension the audience has been holding for months. And sometimes, the most satisfying deaths are the ones you've been waiting for. The ones that feel inevitable and earned and just a little bit complicated. But here's the thing about The Walking Dead that makes it different from most stories. Sometimes the most satisfying outcome isn't death at all. Sometimes it's something worse. Take Negan. After 2 seasons of terrorizing the group, after killing Glenn and Abraham, after brutalizing communities into submission, after becoming the show's most hateable villain, Rick doesn't kill him. In the Season 8 finale, Wrath, Rick slashes Negan's throat just enough to incapacitate him, then tells Sadiq to save his life. And then he locks him in a cell in Alexandria, where Negan will spend years watching the communities rebuild the world he tried to destroy. It's one of the show's most controversial choices, and the fandom is still divided on whether it was the right call. But I think there's something fascinating about why it works as a form of satisfaction, just a very different kind than we've been talking about. Because here's the thing. Negan dying would have been easy. It would have been cathartic in the moment. Rick could have avenged Glenn and Abraham right there, and a huge portion of the audience would have cheered. But the show chose something harder, something that required more from Rick and more from us as viewers. The key to understanding this choice is Carl. Before he died from a walker bite earlier in Season 8, Carl wrote letters to everyone he loved, including his father and, surprisingly, Negan. In his letter to Rick, Carl pleaded for his father to find a way to end the war without more death, to build something better than the cycle of revenge that had consumed both sides. In his letter to Negan, he appealed to the man he thought might still exist under the monster, the person who joked with him and seemed to care about something other than power. Rick's decision to spare Negan is him honoring his son's dying wish. It's him choosing hope over hate, even when hate would be so much easier. And it's a choice that costs him. Maggie is furious. Negan killed her husband right in front of her, and Rick is asking her to let him live. Daryl is conflicted. The whole community struggles with the idea that the man who caused so much pain is just going to sit in a cell, alive, while their loved ones are dead. But here's what makes Negan's imprisonment a form of satisfaction. Even if it's not the kind we expected, it's actually a worse punishment than death. Death would have been an ending for Negan. Prison is the beginning of years of isolation, guilt, reflection, and watching the people he tried to break build something better without him. In later seasons, we see him change. Not all at once, not in a way that erases what he did, but slowly, painfully, into someone who might actually deserve a second chance. And that transformation is only possible because Rick chose mercy over vengeance. This decision also sets up one of the most interesting long-term arcs in the franchise. Dead City, the spin-off with Maggie and Negan, exists because Rick didn't kill him. The complex, uncomfortable relationship between Maggie and the man who killed her husband. The fact that they can work together, even trust each other in small ways, while she still hates him. That's only possible because Rick made the hard choice back in Season 8. Negan living is a constant reminder that redemption is possible, but forgiveness is never owed. So when I think about satisfying deaths in The Walking Dead, I also have to think about satisfying non-deaths, about the choice to let someone live and suffer and possibly grow into something better. It's not the visceral payoff of watching Rick bite out Joe's throat or Michonne run her sword through the governor. It's quieter, more complicated, more true to what the show is really about. The cost of survival, the possibility of change, and the question of whether we can be better than our worst impulses. Sometimes the most satisfying ending is the one that refuses to give you the easy answer. Of course, not every villain gets the luxury of a redemption arc. Some deaths are quick, brutal, and deeply satisfying precisely because they don't waste time. Let's talk about 3 secondary villains whose endings felt perfect, not because they were elaborate, but because they were direct, earned, and deeply cathartic. Gareth, Simon, and Jared. Gareth was the leader of Terminus, the supposed sanctuary that turned out to be a cannibalistic trap. In Season 5's 3rd episode, 4 Walls and a Roof, Rick's group lures Gareth and his hunters into Father Gabriel's church. Gareth tries to talk his way out, tries to appeal to Rick's humanity, tries to make the case that they're all just survivors doing what they have to do. And Rick responds with one of the coldest lines in the entire series. He says, "I already made you a promise," referencing the threat he made back in the Terminus train car. Then, he kills Gareth with a red-handled machete, and the rest of the group finishes off the hunters. What makes this satisfying is the speed of justice. Terminus was only a few episodes ago. The trauma is fresh the moment Rick's group was herded into a train car. The realization that they were being butchered for meat, Bob's infection, and Gareth's taunting. There's no long redemption arc for Gareth, no complexity to unpack. He's a cannibal who hunted them, and Rick keeps his promise. Simple, brutal, and over. Sometimes, that's exactly what a story needs. A villain who exists to create a threat and then gets eliminated without ceremony. Simon is a different case. He was Negan's right-hand man in The Saviors, a gleeful sadist who seemed to enjoy the violence for its own sake. In Season 8, Simon betrays Negan, tries to stage a coup, and murders an entire community, Oceanside's men, against Negan's explicit orders. In the episode Worth, Negan challenges Simon to a leadership fight. It's not a battle, it's an execution. Negan dominates him, then strangles him slowly, deliberately, in front of all the Saviors. Simon reanimates later, and ends up chained to the sanctuary fence, just another walker. Here's what's interesting. Simon's death is satisfying, even though Negan is the one who kills him. We're not supposed to be rooting for Negan at this point, but the show is clever. Simon was worse than Negan. More impulsive, more cruel, more chaotic. By having Negan kill him, the show does 2 things. It eliminates a villain we hated even more than the main antagonist, and it starts the slow process of recontextualizing Negan as someone who, for all his brutality, had limits. Simon didn't. Negan strangling him becomes a strange kind of justice, the monster policing his own. And then there's Jared, the savior who killed young Benjamin back in Season 7 and spent multiple episodes being casually cruel to the Kingdom survivors. In Season 8's Still Gotta Mean Something, Morgan tracks down a group of escaped saviors, and Jared is among them. Morgan, who's been spiraling into violence all season after losing Benjamin, corners Jared and traps him behind a gate with walkers. We watch Jared get devoured, screaming, while Morgan watches without expression. It's not heroic. It's not noble. It's just revenge, raw and unfiltered, and it feels exactly right. The pattern here is important. These deaths work because they're direct responses to specific cruelties. Gareth tried to eat them. Simon massacred innocents. Jared killed a kid. The show sets up the crime, makes us sit with the anger, and then delivers justice quickly. No drawn-out redemption arcs, no complex moral quandaries, just consequence. And there's something deeply satisfying about that simplicity. What's interesting is how the show knows when to use this approach and when not to. Complex villains like the Governor, Alpha, and Negan get complexity in their deaths, or non-deaths. But secondary villains, the ones whose only purpose is to create pain and then be removed from the story, get swift, brutal ends. It's a storytelling economy that respects the audience's time and emotional bandwidth. We don't need every villain to have layers. Sometimes we just need them to pay for what they did and then get out of the way so the story can move forward. And when that happens, when justice is swift and unmistakable, it can be just as satisfying as any elaborate multi-season payoff. So if we're looking for the formula behind what makes a death satisfying in this universe, I think it comes down to three core elements working together: narrative setup, emotional stakes, and character agency. Let's break those down, because I think they explain both the deaths that work and the ones that fall flat. First, narrative setup. A death only feels earned if the story has laid the groundwork for it. That means time giving us enough episodes or seasons with a character that we understand who they are, what they want, and why they're a threat, or why their arc is complete. The Governor got 2 seasons. Alpha got a season and a half. Even smaller villains like Gareth got a full arc from Terminus to the Church. The show gave us time to hate them, to fear them, to understand their motivations, and when they finally died, it felt like the conclusion of something, not just a random event. Compare that to Madison's death in Fear the Walking Dead. In Season 4's No One's Gone, she sacrifices herself by locking herself in a stadium with a horde of walkers and igniting them. It's framed as this heroic, tragic moment, except we never see her body, and the show never commits to the death. The moment is ambiguous, and ambiguity in a death scene almost always feels unsatisfying. The audience doesn't get closure. We're left wondering if she'll come back, and she did in Season 7. There's no sense of completion, no narrative resolution. It's death as a cliffhanger, not as an ending, and that's a fundamentally different thing. Or look at Beta's death in Season 10's finale, A Certain Doom. Beta was the Whisperer's enforcer, a massive, terrifying presence who seemed almost unkillable. When he finally goes down, it's in a coordinated effort by Daryl and Negan, 2 of the group's most capable fighters working together. Daryl stabs him through both eyes with his knives, while Beta is locked in combat with Negan. And then, in his final moments, Beta smiles as walkers surround and devour him. It's a perfect death because the show set it up properly. Beta was established as a massive threat. Multiple characters had to work together to bring him down, and the manner of his death, consumed by the walkers he saw as kin, was thematically appropriate. That's narrative setup done right. Second, emotional stakes. A death is only satisfying if we care about the outcome, if the characters involved matter to us, and if we understand what's on the line. When Rick killed Shane, the emotional stakes were massive. Rick's best friend, Lori's former lover, Carl's pseudo-father figure, the man who saved them all in the early days, but had now become a genuine threat. Shane's death mattered not just because it eliminated a problem, but because it broke Rick's heart to do it. Or think about Carol and Lizzie. The emotional stakes there weren't about vengeance or justice, they were about protection and the soul-crushing weight of survival. Carol killing Lizzie was one of the hardest things any character has had to do in the entire series, and we felt that weight because the show let us see it break her. Tyrese crying, Carol's hands shaking. The quiet horror of walking away from a child's body. That's emotional stakes rendered in the most painful, human way possible. Third, and maybe most crucially, character agency. Satisfying deaths almost always involve the protagonists taking direct action. It's not enough for a villain to die off-screen or get killed by walkers or have some random accident take them out. The group specifically, the characters who have the most personal stakes in the outcome, need to be the ones who deliver justice. Think about the pattern here. Michonne kills the governor, with an assist from Lily, avenging the suffering he caused and Herschel's death. Rick kills Gareth, keeping the promise he made in the train car. Negan kills Alpha after Carol manipulates him into position. Daryl and Negan together take down Beta. Maggie orders Gregory's execution. In every case, the characters we care about are active participants in the resolution. They're not passive observers. They're agents of their own justice. This is partly why the Gimple era of the show, roughly seasons 7 to 8, felt so frustrating to many fans. Deaths felt arbitrary, shock-driven, designed for social media buzz rather than narrative completion. Glenn's death was brutal, yes, but it didn't give the group agency they were forced to watch, helpless. Carl's death from a walker bite felt random and preventable. These weren't satisfying because they stripped agency from the protagonists, made them victims rather than actors in their own story. The Kang era, seasons 9 to 11, course-corrected by returning to deaths that felt earned. Characters made choices that led to specific outcomes. Villains were defeated through planning, courage, and teamwork. The protagonists took back control of the narrative. And that's when deaths started feeling satisfying again, when we could see the characters we love actively shaping their own fates. But here's the flip side. Sometimes the most satisfying deaths are the ones that reject redemption entirely. Not every villain deserves a second chance, and the show is at its most honest when it acknowledges that. Let's talk about two deaths that work precisely because they deny the possibility of growth or forgiveness. Spencer and Gregory. Spencer Monroe shows up in season 6, and from the start, he's coded as weak, self-serving, and cowardly. He's Deanna's son, living in Alexandria's relative safety while others risk their lives. When Negan arrives and establishes his dominance over the community, Spencer sees an opportunity. In season 7's mid-season finale, Hearts Still Beating, Spencer approaches Negan privately, trying to convince him that Rick is a bad leader and that Negan should put Spencer in charge instead. Negan, to his credit, sees right through it. He asks Spencer why he doesn't just kill Rick himself if he's such a problem. Spencer stammers something about respect and the rules, and Negan responds with one of the most memorable kills in the series. You know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking how much I hate your guts. Then he guts him, literally disembowels Spencer right there in the Alexandria street, his intestines spilling onto the pavement. You did have guts, Negan says. I've never been so wrong in my whole life. It's darkly funny, horrifically violent, and deeply satisfying. Why? Because Spencer was trying to betray Rick not through strength or cunning, but through cowardice and manipulation. He wanted power without risk, reward without courage. And Negan, monster that he is, has no respect for that. Spencer's death works because it's a villain being killed by a bigger villain for being too pathetic even by villain standards. There's no redemption arc here, no moment of growth. Spencer dies exactly as he lived, trying to take a shortcut and getting punished for it. Gregory is a longer burn, but follows a similar pattern. He's the leader of the Hilltop when we first meet him in Season 6, and he's immediately shown to be a coward. He caves to Negan's demands. He refuses to fight. He tries to trade Maggie to the Saviors to save his own skin. Even after the war with the Saviors ends, Gregory continues to be a problem, attempting to manipulate people, plotting against Maggie's leadership, and eventually trying to have her assassinated. In Season 9's premiere, A New Beginning, after Gregory fails in his attempt to kill Maggie and is exposed for his role in the plot, Maggie makes a decision. She has a noose prepared and brings Gregory to the Hilltop gallows. Gregory pleads, cries, begs for mercy, and Maggie, without hesitation, orders his execution. Daryl pulls the lever. Gregory hangs. What makes this satisfying isn't just that Gregory was despicable, it's that his death represents a shift in how the communities deal with internal threats. For seasons, Rick's group bent over backward, trying to integrate people, give second chances, believe in redemption. And people like Gregory took advantage of that mercy again and again. Maggie's decision to execute him is her saying, "Some people can't be saved, and trying to save them puts everyone else at risk." It's a hard lesson, and one the show has been building toward since the prison fell. There's a moral complexity here that's worth sitting with. Morgan spent an entire season arguing that all life is precious, that killing is always wrong, that they have to find another way. And the show let that perspective exist and even validated it in some episodes. But it also showed the cost of that philosophy. Benjamin's death, Morgan's mental breakdown, the constant threat posed by people who refuse to change. By the time Maggie hangs Gregory, we understand that mercy has limits. That some choices, like trying to murder the person who gave you safety, forfeit your right to a second chance. So here's the question the show is asking us, and the question I'm asking you. Do we want redemption or revenge? Because the answer seems to be, it depends on the person. Negan gets a chance to change because, despite his monstrosity, he's capable of growth. We see that capacity in small moments, his rapport with Judith, his genuine remorse in later seasons, his willingness to risk himself for the group. But Spencer and Gregory? They're not capable of that growth. They're stuck in patterns of selfishness and cowardice that make them fundamentally incompatible with survival in this world. The show is saying, redemption is possible, but not for everyone. Some people are too broken, too selfish, too dangerous to save. And pretending otherwise doesn't make you moral. It makes you complicit in the harm they'll inevitably cause. Spencer's and Gregory's deaths are satisfying, precisely because they're the story admitting that not everyone deserves a redemption arc. Sometimes death is just death, the consequence of choices made and bridges burned. And that honesty, that refusal to sentimentalize or soften the reality of who these men were, is what makes their endings feel true. In a show that's often criticized for being too bleak, too willing to kill beloved characters for shock value, there's something almost refreshing about deaths that feel justified. Not because they're heroic or tragic, but because they're the natural endpoint of a character who chose cruelty, cowardice, and selfishness at every turn. That's a different kind of satisfaction, not the catharsis of revenge, but the relief of seeing a problem solved, cleanly and without ambiguity. But if we're going to talk about the most satisfying death in the entire series, we have to come back to where we started. Shane Walsh in that field in Season 2. Because Shane's death isn't just satisfying, it's foundational. It's the moment that defined what this show would become, the template for every complex villain and moral choice that followed. Let's trace the arc. Shane and Rick were best friends long before the apocalypse. Shane saved Rick's family when the world ended, getting Lori and Carl out of the hospital and to Atlanta. When Rick was presumed dead, Shane and Lori formed a relationship, not just romantic, but familial, with Shane stepping into the role of Carl's father figure. And then Rick came back, and Shane's world collapsed. He lost Lori. He lost his position as Carl's protector. He lost his purpose. What makes Shane's descent so compelling is that it's gradual and understandable. He doesn't wake up one day and decide to be evil. He starts making small compromises, lying to Lori about Rick, being too aggressive on supply runs, prioritizing survival over morality. And each compromise makes the next one easier, until finally he's standing in that field trying to kill his best friend because he's convinced himself it's the only way to protect Lori and Carl. The three-act structure of their conflict is perfect. Act 1. Shane is the hero, saving Rick's family and keeping them alive. Act 2. Shane becomes a rival, competing with Rick for leadership and Lori's affection. Act 3. Shane becomes a threat, actively planning Rick's murder and putting the whole group at risk. By the time Rick drives that knife into Shane's chest, we understand that this isn't just justified, it's necessary. Shane has become too dangerous, too unstable, too willing to destroy the group to get what he wants. But here's what makes the death linger. Rick doesn't want to do it. Even at the end, even after Shane has lured him into the woods with the clear intent to kill him, Rick is still trying to talk him down. "We can fix this," Rick says. "We can get past this." He's offering Shane a way back, right up until the moment Shane reaches for his gun. And then Rick makes his choice, not with anger or hate, but with heartbreak. He stabs his best friend, and you can see in his face that something inside him dies too. Then Carl shows up. Carl, who's been struggling all season with what it means to survive, who's been watching Shane become more erratic and Rick become harder, arrives just in time to see Shane reanimate. And Carl, this 12-year-old kid, raises his gun and shoots without hesitation. It's the moment Carl stops being a child. It's the moment he learns that survival means making impossible choices and living with the consequences. The emotional layers here are staggering. Betrayal. Shane betrayed Rick's trust, their friendship, everything they built together. Necessity. Rick had no choice but to kill Shane, or Shane would have killed him. Trauma. Carl now has to live with the image of shooting his father's best friend, who was also like a father to him. Guilt. Rick has to carry the weight of killing Shane, knowing that in another world, they could have both survived this. Why does Shane's death endure as the most satisfying in the series? I think it's because it launched Rick's moral complexity. Before Shane, Rick was a straightforward hero, good cop, good husband, good leader. After Shane, he became something more interesting. A man willing to do terrible things for the right reasons. A leader who understood that survival sometimes requires sacrificing parts of yourself you can never get back. Every hard choice Rick makes in later seasons, drowning those guys in the bar, biting out Joe's throat, cutting Negan's throat instead of killing him, traces back to that field and what he learned there. And the show never lets Rick forget it. In Season 9's What Comes After, when Rick is gravely injured and hallucinating, Shane appears to him. They have a conversation about the man Rick has become, about whether the cost of survival was worth it. Shane tells him, "You took it all from me. The baby, the woman. You just took it." And Rick can't argue with him because it's true. Rick took everything Shane wanted, and then he took Shane's life. The ghost of that choice has haunted Rick through every season since. There's a theory I want to float here, and you can agree or disagree. I think every satisfying death in The Walking Dead is satisfying because it creates thematic ripples like Shane's death did. The governor's death forced Rick to confront what he could become. Alpha's death validated Carol's ruthlessness and Negan's capacity for change. Lizzie's death broke Carol in ways she's never fully healed from. These deaths don't just remove characters from the board. They reshape the survivors, change their arcs, redefine their moral boundaries. Shane died in Season 2, but his death is still affecting the story. It's in Rick's choices, in Carl's philosophy, which he wrote about in those letters, in the template for how the show handles friend-turned-enemy arcs. That's the power of a truly satisfying death. It doesn't just end something. It begins something else. It transforms the characters, the story, the entire emotional landscape. And in a show where death is constant and often meaningless, the deaths that matter, the ones we're still talking about years later, are the ones that refuse to be forgotten. So, if that's the template, if we understand what makes death satisfying and how they shape the story, what does that tell us about how the franchise handles villains going forward? Because the pattern is shifting, and I think it's worth paying attention to. In the main series' final arc, the Commonwealth storyline, the show makes an interesting choice with Pamela Milton, the community's governor. She's corrupt, elitist, willing to sacrifice her own citizens to save herself. In the series finale, Rest in Peace, Pamela essentially abandons the lower-class citizens to the Walker Horde while trying to save only the wealthy. Maggie and Carol stop her. And instead of executing her, which would have been the pattern from earlier seasons, they imprison her. General Mercer takes over as the new governor, and Pamela lives out her days in a cell, powerless. It's a deliberate echo of Rick's choice with Negan, and I think it signals a shift in how the franchise thinks about justice. Death is easy. It's closure. But imprisonment, forcing someone to live with what they've done, to watch the world move on without them, that's harder on everyone. It asks more of the survivors to maintain that moral high ground, to resist the easy answer of execution. The fact that the show ended on that note, with Pamela alive and powerless rather than dead, suggests that maybe the ultimate evolution of the group is moving beyond killing as the default solution. Now let's look at the spin-offs, because that's where the franchise is currently exploring these ideas. In The Ones Who Live, the Rick and Michonne series, we get Major General Beale, the leader of the CRM, the Civic Republic military. Beale is set up as the ultimate villain, the architect of a system that bombs communities, kills thousands, and operates on the belief that only total control can save humanity. When Rick finally confronts him in the series finale, he doesn't give Beale a chance to surrender or change. He kills him with Beale's own sword, quickly and definitively. This is a return to the older pattern: big villain, direct threat, swift justice. And it works in that context because the CRM isn't a community of people who can be reasoned with. It's a military hierarchy that requires the leader's removal to dismantle the system. But compare that to Dead City, where Maggie and Negan are navigating a post-apocalyptic Manhattan, and the question isn't whether Negan should die. We've moved past that. But whether Maggie can ever truly forgive him. The villain there isn't a person. It's the unresolved trauma between them. The question of whether redemption is real or just a story we tell ourselves. Here's my prediction. And you can hold me to this. I think the spin-offs are going to continue this pattern of delayed justice. Big villains in limited series will probably die. They have to, because a 6-episode season doesn't have time for the kind of long-game redemption the main series could afford. But in the ongoing spin-offs like Dead City or Daryl Dixon, I think we're going to see more ambiguous endings, more imprisonments, more exiles, more villains who survive but are diminished. The question hanging over Dead City is whether Negan will get his earned death. Fans are divided. Some think Negan's redemption arc is complete, that he's paid his debt and deserves to live out whatever time he has left. Others think he can never truly atone for Glenn's death, that eventually the scales will have to balance, and someone, probably Maggie, will have to make the final call. I don't think the show will give us a clean answer. I think it's going to continue sitting in that uncomfortable space where Negan is useful, even trustworthy in certain situations, but never fully forgiven. There's also the matter of audience expectation versus showrunner choice. The fandom has strong opinions about who deserves to die and who deserves to live. We get attached to our theories, our sense of justice, our ideas about what would be most satisfying. But the showrunners don't always give us what we want. They give us what the story needs. Sometimes that aligns with our expectations, and we get the cathartic villain death we've been craving. Sometimes it doesn't, and we're left with something more complicated and harder to process. I think that's actually a strength of the franchise at this point. It's willing to frustrate us, to deny easy answers, to keep us in the gray area where most real moral decisions actually live. Not every villain needs to die. Not every death needs to feel good. And the characters who survive, Negan, Pamela, even Jadis, Anne, who's still out there somewhere, become living reminders that the world is messier than our desire for justice would like it to be. Think about Georgie, the mysterious woman who helped Maggie back in Season 8 and then disappeared. We never got closure on that story. We never found out what happened to her or why she left. And that's frustrating, sure, but it's also realistic. In the apocalypse, not every story gets an ending. Some people just leave, and you never know if they're alive or dead, thriving or suffering. That ambiguity might not be satisfying in the traditional sense, but it's true to the world the show has built. So when we talk about the future of deaths in this franchise, I think we're talking about a show that's matured past the point where every villain needs a dramatic execution scene. Some will die, absolutely, but others will live, and we'll have to sit with that discomfort, that lack of closure, that question of whether mercy or justice is the right choice. And maybe, just maybe, the most satisfying ending isn't the one where everyone gets what they deserve, but the one where the survivors learn to live with the fact that the world doesn't work that way. That's the lesson Rick learned when he spared Negan. That's the lesson the franchise is still teaching us. One complicated, uncomfortable, deeply human death, or non-death, at a time. But let's be honest for a moment. This pursuit of satisfaction, this need to see villains die in ways that feel earned, what does it cost us? Because I think The Walking Dead, at its best, isn't just giving us cathartic villain deaths. It's asking us to examine our own relationship with violence, with justice, with the stories we tell ourselves about who deserves to suffer. Take Carol and Lizzie again. That death was satisfying. In a narrative sense, it completed Carol's arc, protected the group, solved an impossible problem. But watch the scene again and look at Carol's face. She's not satisfied. She's destroyed. She has to live with what she did for the rest of her life. Years later, we still see her carrying that trauma, that guilt, that knowledge that she murdered a child even if it was necessary. The show gave us the death we needed, but it made sure we understood the cost. Or think about Rick sparing Negan. That choice has defined Rick's final seasons and Carl's entire legacy. Carl's letter begged his father to find a better way, to build a world where mercy was possible even for the worst people. And Rick tried. He really tried. But that mercy came at a cost. Maggie's rage, Daryl's disappointment, the fracturing of the group, and Rick's own eventual departure from the show. Choosing hope over catharsis almost broke everything they'd built. There's a theory I want to float here, and it's going to be uncomfortable. I think the best deaths in The Walking Dead are the ones that leave us feeling satisfied and unsettled in equal measure. Not purely cathartic, not purely tragic, but somewhere in between. They give us what we think we want, the villain dead, the threat eliminated, justice served, and then they show us the cost. They make us complicit in the violence by making us cheer for it, and then they ask, was it worth it? When Rick bit out Joe's throat, we cheered. He was protecting Carl from something unspeakable. But then we had to watch Carl look at his father afterward, covered in blood, more animal than man, and we had to ask ourselves, what does it do to a person to become that? What does it do to a child to see their parent become that? The death was satisfying, but the aftermath was haunting. When Negan killed Alpha, we felt relief. The Whisperers were terrifying, and Alpha was responsible for so much death. But then we had to watch Negan struggle with what it meant, whether this act of violence could balance the scales of his past crimes, whether Carol manipulated him into doing something he wasn't ready to do. The death solved a problem, but it created new moral questions. So here's the uncomfortable question. Do satisfying deaths make us complicit in the violence? When we watch Rick kill Shane, or Michonne kill the governor, or Maggie hang Gregory, when we feel that surge of satisfaction, that sense of justice served, are we endorsing the idea that violence is the solution to human problems? Or are we just recognizing that in this world, in this apocalypse the show has created, sometimes violence is the only option left? I don't think the show wants us to be comfortable with that answer. I think it wants us to sit in that gray area, to feel both the satisfaction of justice and the horror of what justice requires. Carol killing Lizzie was necessary and traumatizing. Rick sparing Negan was merciful and infuriating. These aren't clean choices. They're messy, complicated, human decisions made under impossible circumstances. And that's what makes the show more than just violence porn or shock value deaths. It's interested in the psychology of survival. What happens to your soul when you have to make these choices again and again? How many people can you kill before you lose yourself? How much mercy can you afford before it gets you or someone you love killed? Where's the line between justice and revenge, between protection and cruelty? Morgan spent entire seasons grappling with this. His all life is precious philosophy was beautiful and unsustainable. He couldn't reconcile his moral code with the reality of the world, and it broke him. He killed when he swore he wouldn't. He failed to kill when he should have. And the show never told us who was right, Morgan or Carol, the philosopher or the pragmatist. It let both perspectives exist, let both characters suffer for their choices, and asked us to decide for ourselves. That's the emotional bridge the show is building. From vengeance to understanding to acceptance that some deaths heal and others haunt. Shane's death healed the immediate threat, but haunted Rick forever. The governor's death healed the group's trauma, but cost them Herschel. Alpha's death healed the Whisperer crisis, but didn't heal Carol's grief. Every satisfying death comes with a price tag, and the show makes sure we see the receipt. So what does our need for justice cost us? I think it costs us the ability to see villains as fully human. When we reduce them to monsters who need to be eliminated, we lose the complicated truth that they're people who made choices, often terrible choices, but choices nonetheless. The governor was a father who lost his daughter and couldn't cope with the grief. Shane was a man who saved his best friend's family and couldn't accept that he wasn't the hero of the story. Even Negan, for all his atrocities, was trying to build something to save people, even if his methods were monstrous. The show is at its best when it refuses to give us simple villains and simple deaths. When it makes us work for our satisfaction, makes us sit with the moral complexity, makes us question whether the violence we just cheered for was actually the right choice. That's uncomfortable. That's unsettling. That's exactly what good storytelling should do, because in the end, the most satisfying deaths aren't the ones that make us feel good. They're the ones that make us feel something complicated: relief and regret, justice and grief, closure and haunting. They're the deaths that stick with us, not because they were brutal or shocking, but because they asked something of us as viewers. They asked us to think about what we're willing to do to survive, and whether we'd be able to live with ourselves afterward. That's the cost of satisfaction. Knowing that sometimes, even when we get what we wanted, we still lose something we can never get back. So let's close by talking about the deaths we're still waiting for. The arcs that feel incomplete. The villains who got anticlimactic endings. The threads that remain unresolved. Because for all the satisfying deaths we've analyzed, there are just as many that left us wanting. Take Lance Hornsby. He was set up as a major villain in Season 11, the Commonwealth's deputy governor, a political operator who was always 3 steps ahead. He manipulated communities, tried to seize power, and seemed poised for a dramatic downfall. And then, in the episode What's Been Lost, Carol shoots him in the neck with a crossbow bolt during a confrontation, and he dies. Not in a finale. Not in some grand confrontation with multiple characters getting closure. Just done. His reanimated corpse shows up later in the series finale as a brief callback when Pamela nearly gets herself killed by him, but as a villain arc, it's underwhelming given how much screen time his scheming received. It's not that Lance's death was bad, exactly. It's that it felt anticlimactic. The show spent episodes building him up as this Machiavellian threat, and then dispensed with him quickly, almost as an afterthought. There's something to be said for subverting expectations, for showing that not every villain gets a dramatic death scene. But there's also something frustrating about investing in a character's arc and then not getting any emotional payoff from their end. Leah Shaw is another example. She was Daryl's love interest during the 6-year time jump between seasons 9 and 10, a member of the Reapers, a character with real potential for emotional complexity. The relationship between her and Daryl could have been a deep exploration of loyalty, love, and the impossible choices survival demands. Instead, after several episodes of build-up, Daryl shoots her in the back of the head in acts of God to save Maggie. Quick, efficient, and emotionally hollow. Don't get me wrong, I understand why Daryl made that choice. Leah had captured Maggie, was about to kill her, and Daryl chose his found family over his past love. That's consistent with his character and the show's themes. But the execution felt rushed. We didn't get a moment of Leah realizing what Daryl was about to do. Didn't get any real emotional closure on their relationship. Didn't get to see Daryl process what it meant to kill someone he loved. She just died, and the show moved on. Given how much the Reaper arc dominated the first half of Season 11, her death deserved more weight. And then there are the open threads. the characters who are still out there, whose fates remain unresolved. Jadis, also known as Anne, is a prime example. She went from being a leader of the scavengers to becoming a CRM operative to ultimately disappearing into the CRM system. She appears in The Ones Who Live, and we get some closure on her story, but for years she was just out there, a dangling thread. Georgie, the woman who helped Maggie and gave her the Book of Knowledge, vanished between seasons and has never been seen or mentioned again. These unresolved arcs aren't necessarily bad storytelling. Sometimes people just leave and you never know what happened to them, but they deny us the satisfaction of closure. Here's what I think is interesting. The show seems more willing now to leave things unresolved than it used to be. In the earlier seasons, most villains got definitive ends. Shane died. The governor died. Terminus got burned down. Its leaders killed. But as the show matured and spun off into multiple series, the endings became more ambiguous. Pamela lives. Negan lives. Jadis lives. The show is comfortable now letting us sit with that lack of closure, that absence of the clean death scene we might be expecting. My prediction? The Ones Who Live has the potential to deliver one more truly satisfying villain death if the show chooses to revisit Rick's internal demons or bring back a threat from his past. Rick's final justice moment could be something symbolic, not killing a person, but finally putting to rest the ghost of the man he used to be, the sheriff who thought he could save everyone. That would be a different kind of death, a metaphorical one, but potentially just as satisfying as any physical confrontation. Or maybe the franchise moves away from satisfying deaths entirely. Maybe it leans into the discomfort, the ambiguity, the reality that most conflicts don't end with a dramatic death scene, but with exhaustion, compromise, and moving on. That would be a bold choice, one that trusts the audience to sit with complexity rather than craving catharsis. Here's my question for you. Which death did you find most satisfying? Was it Shane's, with all its emotional weight and the launch of Rick's moral complexity? Was it the governor's, the culmination of 2 seasons of build-up and horror? Was it Alpha's, with Negan as the unexpected instrument of justice? Was it one of the quick, brutal deaths, like Gareth's or Joe's, where the satisfaction came from swift consequence? Or maybe it was one of the non-deaths, Rick choosing to imprison Negan, choosing hope over hate, even when hate would have been so much easier. Maybe the most satisfying moment wasn't a death at all, but a character choosing to let someone live, and all the complicated consequences that flowed from that choice. I think different deaths resonate with different viewers based on what we value in storytelling. If you value emotional complexity, Shane's death probably hits hardest. If you value thematic completion, the governor's death closes the most loops. If you value character agency and earned payoffs, Alpha's death delivers on multiple fronts. If you value moral courage, Rick sparing Negan might be the most satisfying moment in the entire series. The Walking Dead has given us all of these types of deaths, and that diversity is part of what makes the show work. It doesn't lock itself into one philosophy of justice or one approach to villain arcs. It lets different deaths mean different things. Let some be cathartic and others be complicated. Let some feel complete and others feel frustratingly unresolved. That's messy, sure. But it's also honest. And after 11 seasons, multiple spin-offs, and countless character deaths, the franchise has earned the right to be complicated. So as we wait for future chapters in this universe, more Dead City, more Daryl Dixon, whatever comes next, I think the question isn't just who's going to die, but what's that death going to mean? Will it heal something, or will it haunt? Will it feel earned, or will it feel arbitrary? Will it give us closure, or will it leave us with more questions? And maybe, just maybe, the most satisfying answer is all of the above, depending on what the story needs and what we're willing to accept. There's a moment worth returning to, now that we've traced this thread from beginning to end. That field on Herschel's farm, empty now in our memory except for the wind moving through the tall grass. Shane's body is gone, buried, or burned. The show never told us which, but the moment remains, crystallized. Rick with a knife, Carl with a gun, Laurie crying in the distance, unaware that everything just changed. Every satisfying death in The Walking Dead traces back to that moment. Not because they're all structured the same way, but because Shane's death taught the show and taught us what was possible. It taught us that death could be more than shock value or horror. It could be the ending of an arc, the transformation of a character, the moment when someone becomes who they were always going to become. Rick became the survivor in that field. Carl became the realist. And Shane became the ghost that haunted every difficult choice that followed. Was it justice or just survival? I think the answer is both, and neither. And it depends on which day you ask me. Some days, I think Rick had no choice, that Shane had become too dangerous and unstable to let live. Other days, I think maybe there was a path they didn't see, a way to bring Shane back from the edge. But that's the beauty of it, isn't it? The show doesn't tell us what to think. It just shows us what happened and lets us sit with the weight of it. The recurring motif we've traced, knives versus guns, personal violence versus distant killing, culminates in that image. Rick's knife was intimate, close, the violence of a friend ending a friend. Carl's gun was final, distant enough to protect him from the full horror, but close enough that he'd never forget. One was necessary brutality. The other was mercy. Together, they were the full truth of what survival demands. You do what you have to, in whatever way you can, and then you live with it. The flowers on those unmarked graves, Carol's flowers, Lizzie's flowers, the flowers that grow over Shane's memory, and every other difficult death this show has given us. They're not there because death is beautiful. They're there because the living needs something to mark what was lost, what was sacrificed, what could never be taken back. Every satisfying death plants a seed like that, something that grows in the characters' minds, shapes their choices, reminds them of the cost. So maybe the real question isn't what makes a death satisfying. Maybe it's what makes us remember it, what makes it matter beyond the moment of violence, beyond the visceral thrill or horror. And I think the answer is the deaths that change the survivors. The deaths that make Rick see himself clearly, make Carol question her choices, make Maggie choose hope even when revenge would be easier. The deaths that refuse to be forgotten, that become part of the story in ways the dead person never could have predicted. Shane died, thinking he was protecting Laurie and Carl. But his death actually protected them in a way he never intended, by forcing Rick to become strong enough to lead, by teaching Carl the hard lessons Shane couldn't, by clearing space for the family to heal. That's the paradox. Sometimes the most satisfying deaths are the ones that accomplish something the dying person never wanted, never saw coming, never understood. That empty field, wind through the grass, the flowers growing where the blood soaked into Georgia soil, it's still there in the show's mythology, still haunting Rick in his final episodes, still shaping Carl's philosophy in those letters he wrote before he died, still teaching us that satisfaction isn't about feeling good. It's about feeling something true.